Hi, my name is David Knight, and welcome to those amazing Psalms. Psalm 40, Finding Your New Song. Psalm 40 is the song of someone who has experienced a new lease on life. The singer was in a desperate mud pit of slippery forces or circumstances beyond his control. The opening words, "I waited patiently for the Lord," are perhaps better translated as the Message says it, "I waited and waited and waited for God," suggesting that his distress as well as his cries for deliverance went on for a long time. Describing his plight as mud and mire reminds me of the Hebrews slaving away in the mud pits of Egypt, making bricks decade after decade, until God appeared to Moses and said, "I have seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. I am aware of their suffering, so I have come down to rescue them and to lead them into their own fertile and spacious land." This is what God did for the psalmist. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Slippery slopes and slimy pits come in all shapes and sizes, and this song reminds me of friends of mine who have been stuck in the quagmire of addiction to drugs or alcohol or pornography or hoarding or eating or not eating. Others have found themselves slipping into depression or migraines or anger, dark pits of helplessness. Other pits are more subtle forms of bondage, like bondage to work or applause, or binging on Netflix, or staying in unhealthy relationships. You try to resist, but you keep falling into it again and again. You despair of ever being really free and regaining your traction and momentum. The music of the mud pits of the world is a sad dirge, each with its own discordant melody that rises to God like a collective groan. But the psalmist has experienced a freedom he hardly dreamed possible. Finally, he feels like he has a firm place to stand and discovers a new song in his mouth. The new song is a first-hand experience of God, a personal testimony of God's reality and intervention in his life that he wants to share with others. This is not unique to this singer. People down through history who have tasted God's new freedom inevitably discover fresh language to express their sense of new life and renewed hope. The psalmist expresses his new outlook on life that goes along with his new song. In verse 4 to 5, he says, "Many, O Lord, are the wonders you have done, the things you have planned for us. None can compare with you. Were I to speak and tell of your deeds, they would be too many to declare." He has an expanded awareness of God's uniqueness and wonder. And that translates into daily life with fresh insight into what God really wants from his children. In verse 6, he says, "Sacrifice and offering is not really what you desire," or as the Message renders it, being religious, acting pious, that's not what you're asking for. You've opened my ears so I can listen. I desire to do your will, my God. Your law is within my heart. In response to what God has done for him, he longs to honor God with all his heart and strength. And then he wants to share that experience with others. In verse 9, he says, "I have talked about your faithfulness and saving power. I have told everyone in the great assembly of your justice and your unfailing love," because he knows that there are others who need to hear a word of hope in their lives. Then in verse 11, the psalm makes a sharp left turn. Suddenly, the song of thanksgiving becomes a lament, a desperate plea for help. "Do not withhold your mercy from me, Lord, for troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I can't see. My heart fails within me. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. Where did this come from? It feels like an intruder. The psalmist has escaped his slimy pit and found new footing. He is singing his new song and teaching it to others. He is living a fresh, authentic life of devotion, and suddenly troubles without number surround me. My sins have overtaken me, and I cannot see. This tells us that life is never a straight line upwards and onwards. It's more like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. One minute you're on a mountaintop, and suddenly you're blindsided by temptation, by doubt or fear or opposition. And that's where the first part of the psalm becomes an invaluable resource. Troubles without number in verse 12 are matched by God's deeds without number in verse 5. The desires of the enemies in verse 14 are counterbalanced by the desires of the psalmist to do God's will in verse 8. Our past experiences of God give us perspective and hope to face the challenges of tomorrow. In the words of Vancouver musician Roy Salmon, we're stumbling heavenward, but we have a song of God's faithfulness that He gives us, that gives us confidence that He who began a good work in us will not abandon His work, but continue it in us until He brings us fully into the new creation. Come quickly, Lord, to help me. If God has given you a song, or you've had an experience of deliverance or setback, I'd love to hear from you. Please write a comment in the space below the screen and share your story with me and with others. Take care.